But today, we have two leading Lehman College educators, Emita Hill and Janet Munch, who will share oral histories of life in the Bronx in the 1970s and 1980s. Their book, Bronx Voices and Faces, 16 stories of courage and community captures the courage of the men and women of that borough, whether crime, arson, and drug dealers. Dr. Hill interviewed the subjects, and she spent 20 years in the Bronx with many posts at Lehman, finishing as vice principal. Recently, she retired as chancellor of Indiana University, Kokomo. Dr. Hill graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Cornell University, received a master's degree from Middlebury College, and a PhD from Harvard University in Romance Languages and Literature. And Janet Munch, who is here, is professor and librarian at Lehman. She'll talk about the school's rich research collection on the Bronx, which has been utilized by journalists and writers for their background material. The photographs are really beautiful. So I hope you will all welcome. Thank you.
Trying not to use the mic unless you tell me you can't hear me. Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Mr. Latimer, for being here. And some of you I've met because I've driven some of you, and some of you I've met through PDO in other ways. I actually live in your shop, right? Not in Larchmont, but I'm here most of the time. This book is something that started in around 1980. Actually, it started earlier, but I won't give you the whole prehistory. I was at Lehman for 20 years. Janet came in 1985 and took over the Special Collections Library. I was there during the New York fiscal crisis, a time of disaster, when everything right and left was being cut, whether it was books or music or faculty, bodies, whatever. And so really, that was an early inspiration, not necessarily for all history, but for trying to write grants, trying to bring in other sources of funding when the traditional state funding for the university wasn't there, and in particular to protect things that are always cut, like the arts, languages, music. And in the course of that time, I was fortunate in getting several large grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which kind of convinced me that if you have a really good idea, and you have the Bronx, which is where you're operating, put the two together, the neediness, especially at that time, and a really good idea, and you're very likely to be funded. And this was an extraordinarily exciting project. I'm not an oral historian. I'm not a historian at all. My field is French literature. But teaching in the Bronx, being there day to day over the 1970s and the 1980s, you either leave it or you develop a deep love for it and commitment to it. And the students that I had in my classes, while some of them commuted from the other boroughs, predominantly they were from the Bronx. And many of them, because this was the time of open admissions in City University, I don't know how familiar you are with this, but it was a time, a grandiose commitment to allow any student who completed any high school in the 5 boroughs to come into one of the City University colleges, whether 2-year or 4-year. It was a huge investment in the future and in young people, and many of them benefited tremendously. Some fell by the wayside. It was extremely expensive. Eventually, like all other good ideas, it got watered down and cut back, but it was a very exciting time to be there. And the students that I met, and also the older students or auditors who would come in and sit in the same classrooms with these young students, made me, as someone who's not from the Bronx, made me very aware of the diversity, the new younger students who were predominantly African American, Hispanic, although there were a lot of Italians, and the older people coming into the same classrooms who were predominantly Jewish, Italian, Polish, totally different spectrum, Irish, and sitting next to each other in the same classrooms really, I think, is where the idea for let's save some of these memories, let's get some of these stories, let's not let this moment in time pass away. Oral history is very popular now. You have StoryCorps on NPR, you off. People are becoming aware of the fact that if you don't record somebody's memories now, all of you in this room, 50 years from now, your memories won't be there. And so I think there is a tremendous interest now in having younger people interview their parents, interview their grandparents. But this was new for us and new for our campus at the time that we were doing it. And one of you earlier this afternoon said, oh yes, celebrities. And I said, no, not celebrities. When we wrote the grant, we said we wanted to interview Mr. and Mrs. Everyman. We wanted the stories of the people who were living in the community, living ordinary lives, committed to the community. The people who did not leave, because that was a very difficult time in the Bronx, and a lot of people, understandably, did leave, whether they went to Co-op City or they went to Florida, they went to Long Island, they came to Westchester. They didn't want to deal with the problems. The people in this book, and there are many other, over 400 hours of tapes in the Lehman Library, because I wasn't the only person doing this. I was the director of the program, but I wasn't the only person doing it. The people we were interviewing were people who were still in the Bronx. They had not left, in spite of the hard times. And so, among the ones in this book, I interviewed 30, and I selected 16 stories. Really on the basis that they were the best stories. Again, I'm not a historian, I'm not an anthropologist, I didn't have an agenda. I wasn't trying to study arson or architecture or policing or any topic. I wanted stories, whatever people wanted to tell me. So the people in this book, community organizers, a number of them, a priest, an African-American bishop of the Rapture Preparation Apostolic Church, wonderful man, a realtor, a tenant association guy, a mix, someone who was deeply involved in trying to develop new industries, invest in industries in the Bronx, started something called Bronx Venture, a wonderful woman, some of you may have known her, who Irma Fleck, her story is such a feminist story because when she was a little girl, family of Polish, Jewish refugees, her father was a doctor, her future husband was a doctor, grew up as the sister of brothers, and of course, the sister didn't get the college education the brothers did. She wasn't important. She would stay home and help her dad. She accepted that. But during World War II, Irma decided she better get a college degree and be able to make some money herself while her husband was away. And she said, I discovered I wasn't done after all. And I discovered that women matter too. It's a wonderful story. She went on to create, literally, the Bronx Council on the Arts. And then she went one step further, created the Bronx Museum, which is there to this day. And then she retired from that. And looking around for something else to do, she said, the three things we've got in the Bronx right now, and by then she was not a young person anymore. She said, we have rubble-strewn lots, yes. We have unemployment. We have garbage. She said, I'm a gardener, I can put these things together. And she literally did. She put together a program called the Bronx Frontier, greening these rubble lots, getting community people to develop community gardens, putting together, those of you who make compost would understand this, I'm not that good a gardener, putting together the garbage from the Bronx with the leaves from Westchester, with the Zudu from the Bronx Zoo, and creating areas that were fertile and beautiful. I mean, this was an amazing woman. And it's that kind of story of people who, they're no major, they're not called celebrities, but they're people, like many of you, who make a big difference to the community where they live. And so that's why when this book finally came to fruition, 30 years after I did the interviews, and I won't go into that long story of how you find a publisher and how you get a book made, that was miraculous. But that's why we used the subtitle, 16 Stories of Courage and Community, because that's what it was about, the courage not to leave when things got difficult, and the deep commitment and involvement in their community in their different ways. And we do have some politicians, Mr. Latimer. We did, in part because the then president of my college said to me, this is well and good, but you should interview some of the people who really have an overview of the whole borough, and in particular, a couple of the borough presidents. And the stories are quite wonderful. Mario Biaggi's story is in here, Bobby Abrams' story is in here. Bobby, by the way, is going to be honored early in June at the Bronx Museum in the first Jewish Roll of Honor. I may not have the wording quite right, for the Bronx. Very exciting, lovely man. But it all started because we wanted to capture the stories from that time. The reason it's called Bronx Faces, not just Bronx Voices, is that two amazing photographers were willing to work with me. One had been the president of Photo Day, a contemporary and a friend and a peer of Louis Hine and Paul Strand and many of the other greats in those days, 30s and 40s. And he had had a Guggenheim by chance to work in the South Bronx, to take photographs in the South Bronx 2 years before I started doing these interviews. And we got to know each other, and I got him to come and lecture at Lehman and show his wonderful photographs. And so when the book was being put together, Walter Rosenblum is now deceased, unfortunately, but I asked his widow, Naomi, who's a great historian of photography, I said, Naomi, I have this book and their stories, and Walter didn't photograph my people, but his photographs, which are always of people, Walter had no interest in landscapes, it was always beautiful faces, finding beauty in faces, finding beauty in the nurse in the hall, the woman in the waiting room, the extraordinary photographs. Can I use it in the book? And she said, of course, yes. And then a lot of the other photographs are done by one of Walter's absolute top students, who's a professor of photography at CUNY, and who did most of the pictures of children in the book. We had hoped to show you the pictures on a PowerPoint. They're in the book, but I'm going to hand some of them around and just get them back to us at the end of the afternoon. I think you'll enjoy looking at them. These, I think these are Walter's photographs, many of them taken at Lincoln Hospital. There are many stories in the book about Fordham Hospital, which was gone by the time we had the photographs, but these were in Lincoln Hospital. It's been very exciting to have the book, and I've been talking about it with different groups. It's been used by a couple of book clubs to my great delight, where then everybody's read it, and I'm talking to them and I say, whoops, they know more than I do. And a couple of weeks ago, I talked to 50 fifth graders in the Bronx who had actually read 4 of the stories. Their teachers had pulled 4 of the stories and had them read. They were amazing. They had so many questions. They were so enthusiastic. So it's been enormously gratifying. And unfortunately, because it was such a long time, my career made it impossible to do anything. And I wasn't thinking about the book. I was thinking about saving the stories, putting them safely in the library. That was it. By having taken so long, 30 years, some of the people in the book, by the time it came out, were deceased. Several had died this winter who were alive when it came out. A couple had Alzheimer's. But what I discovered was how much it meant to their children and grandchildren and friends who had no idea that Irma or Mario or any of the others had been interviewed. In fact, some of the people I interviewed had forgotten I'd interviewed them. And it was a revelation to see how much it meant. And the daughter of one of the women with Alzheimer's said to me, "You're giving me back my mother." And I found that such a beautiful, beautiful concept. Because these were stories that she'd never heard when was a child. So I'm going to stop there. And Janet, as I say, is the custodian of the treasure. All the photographs, all the stories, all the records, and can tell you a little bit. If any of you are interested in Bronx history or pursuing it, there's an amazing treasure trove at Lehman College on the Bronx. And afterwards, I will read a little bit and we'll answer questions. Thank you.
Well, it's nice to see so many of you here today, and obviously there's an interest in the Bronx. I'm the Special Collections Librarian at Lehman College, and when I came in 1985, one of the reasons that I was hired was I was from the Bronx. I had worked for the Bronx County Historical Society early on in my career. And so it was wonderful to see the collection that had developed in the library about the Bronx as a result of the oral histories that were coming in. So the oral histories were captured, and very often these interviews were done in people's homes. So the interview would go into the home and there'd be family photographs, and the project photographer, Georgine Comfort, you're looking at Georgine's photographs that are going around now. Very often family photograph albums would come in, they'd be, photographs would be taken and the slides would be made and so on. And then the albums would be returned. And so these images that came in were used for exhibits, they were used for research. They were used for publication. There were a lot of different uses of it, so we had those at Lehman College. So in addition to that, there were other collections that came in. So it started with individuals, with interview, but it also developed into collections from organizations, like the Riverdale Neighborhood House in the Bronx. Some of you may know that organization. It's probably about 125 years old now. The Bronx Chamber of Commerce collection, Jill Jones Papers, you may know the book South Bronx Rising, and a number of other collections that have come in, working pages of writers and so on. And the collection, of course, is wonderful for students. They come, they use the materials that we have, whether it's the photographs, the books, prints, whatever it is that we have about the Bronx. We also have courses that run on New York City and on the Bronx at Lehman. So the students are actively using these materials, particularly the primary sources. And so it's something that's developed over time. There were exhibits that were done. We had an exhibit, well, actually it was called Bronx Voices also. And that would circulate to schools and hospitals and nursing homes. And very often this is how people found out about the oral history project that was going on at that time. The project isn't running anymore. It ran for about 10 years and then it stopped. The funding ran and stopped for it. But we have all of those materials. And so there, for example, there was an exhibit at the gallery at Lehman College, and it was childhood in the Bronx. And so the exhibit ran for about 6 weeks. These were Georgine's photographs, some of which you're seeing, which are in the book. And so it was a wonderful exhibit, got reviewed in the New York Times, the Daily News, and then the exhibit was over. And then I had the opportunity of applying for a grant to create a website. So I thought to myself, well, it would be good to put those images up. And then in addition to that, we had digitized the sound, we had digitized the oral histories. So in addition to having the photographs up, there's an actual website, Childhood in the Bronx, which if you go into Google and just put in Childhood in the Bronx, you'll come right to it. And we have about 10 minutes of excerpts from these oral histories with people just talking about the childhood. So it's nice to see the picture, to see the description of what people are saying, and then to actually hear the voice of somebody who's much older reflecting back on the childhood in the Bronx. The Bronx Chamber of Commerce collection, which I mentioned, we also have those photographs up on the web as well. At the moment I'm forgetting the title of the website. But if you come to Lehman College's homepage and you look at the library's homepage, under the digital projects, you'll see that project. Also, those of you that know the Bronx, there's another very nice website, Bronx Architecture. So a lot of buildings in the Bronx, and so there's a description of the different sites. They could be historic sites, they could be buildings on the concourse, they could be schools, and so on. So, so I did a lot of the writing for that, along with some other people. And so in addition to the description, there's also photographs of that as well. So that's a nice collection to use. So it started with the oral histories, and the materials are still being actively used. If you know the book, The Encyclopedia of New York City, several of our photographs have been used in that book as well. I brought some photographs today, which I'll circulate around to you. And how many of you are from the Bronx, have lived in the Bronx? Oh, actually a lot of you. So I'm going to pass this around, and of course you can't see it from where you are now, but these are taken from this Bronx Chamber of Commerce collection that I had spoken about. And I'm sure you'll recognize the sites as they go along. The first one, I'm going to let you guess what that is, but I think most of you are going to know. And there's a theater in the Bronx, which you'll see a before, an early picture and a later picture, and you'll know where it is when you see it. The Dollar Savings Bank, what you know is the Dollar Savings Bank, it's now Immigrant Savings Bank, is there as well. So anybody from the Bronx is going to recognize the site. There's also an interior view of it as well. And I was looking at the picture today myself, and I was remembering that when we were in grade school, everybody had a bank account. Every child had an account at the Dollar Savings Bank with your passbook, and they had. It's amazing, you think of the ATMs today. You're not necessarily going into the banks even, but they had all these counters where people used to go, and it was always very busy. And I also remember the floral shows they would have. They would art shows in the banks. And another nice one, this is Southern Boulevard and 180th Street, an early picture. And another one, well actually they're labeled, so you'll see them as they go around. The first one's not, but I think you're going to know what it is. So let me pass these around so you can look at them.
May I ask what part of the Bronx you grew up in?
I grew up in the West Bronx, in the area below the old NYU campus, Burnside University, and later we moved to Parkchester. So I lived on both sides of the Bronx. Parkchester, right? That's right. You lived in Parkchester too?
No, Throgsneck.
Oh, Throgsneck, yeah, okay. Well, I'll let Emita speak now. And, you know, you can get in touch with me if you'd like to come down and see us. You know, just give me a call. And, you know, we'll schedule an appointment for you to come in. I'm not in special collections all the time. This is why I'm saying this. Because I'm doing other things in the library as well. But I know Emita would like to read some sections from the book to you, which I think you'll enjoy.
Janet's talking about all the photographs that we had, and again, this was the early 80s, 82, 83, when we were doing this, and the worst of the arson was in the late 70s, the 60s and 70s. But people still had that in their mind, in their memories. And we got a lot of publicity for this project, and in some cases people would call up and say they wanted to be interviewed, which we would do, if we could. In other cases, they would come bringing us their family albums, and churches would bring us their precious documents, and we said we cannot keep them. But as Janet said, we could make slides of the photographs, and this is how there are so many vintage photographs, because people really wanted us to safe keep the things that they wanted to preserve, you know, in case there was more arson, in case there was, it was an extraordinary time. And they saw the university as a kind of refuge, a safe place, which we were happy to have them feel that, but we weren't a museum. We couldn't hold all their objects. But we did get a tremendous collection. This is a story which I have to say that those fifth graders particularly liked, resonated with them. This is Mo Greenstein, Morris Greenstein, whose son is a realtor here in Larchmont. And he's been very pleased that his father was remembered in this way. And one of the interesting things about Mo, I'm just going to read you a childhood story, but he, without my knowing it, when we were doing these interviews, he had an influence on many of the other lives. I mentioned earlier someone who started Bronx Venture, a man named Mike Nunez. And he was looking for companies to invest in that were already in the Bronx and needed support. Who founded the first industry? Mo Greenstein. The Bishop Crooms, with his rapture preparation of church, he was looking for a building a little bit larger than the one room he'd already had. He went past the building, it was boarded up, no signs, nothing. Later on he came back, there was a sign with Mo Greenstein's name and phone number. And there's a beautiful story there. He called out of the blue, this man named Greenstein, and said, I want your building for my church. And Mo, never having met him, simply said on the phone, it's yours. I mean, it takes my breath away when I still read it now. And Bishop Groom said, well, don't you want to deposit $100, $200? No, it's yours. And helped him negotiate the more. And several of the others. His name crops up. He knew so many people in the Bronx, and he knew the buildings. I'm not going to read you that part, but he was really educating me in his story, telling me how to date buildings by their cornices or by the kind of bathtubs they had, with legs, without legs, on an apron. Anyway, really extraordinary detail, and you could see how much he loved it and loved the care of those buildings. But back to this, it's a childhood story when the Bronx was overflowing with new residents, and there was a shortage of schools, and kids walked miles to go to school, and some of them were in annexes, and as he says, very different from children these days. In those days, everyone I knew, with few exceptions, only very few exceptions, were either Jewish or Italian immigrants, in which the parents spoke no English. The mother spoke none, and the father may have spoken some because he was out in trade and he had to learn a little English. I looked at my yearbook in Monroe, and we were 99% Jewish and Italian, really almost all Jewish. The thing we were afraid of, we were very much afraid of our teachers, because in those days, in the early 20s, was before the Jewish teachers came in, it was all Irish teachers. And we were afraid that they would ask our mother to come to school. The worst thing they could do to you, if you chewed gum or you spoke out of turn, they'd say, bring your mother to school. And it wasn't so much bring in your mother as you were afraid to bring in your mother because you didn't want your teacher to know that your mother didn't understand English. You didn't want anybody to know that your mother couldn't speak English. I used to witness a kid whose mother would come in school and he'd warn her, Mama, please don't say anything, make believe you understand. And the mother would come in and they would go out in the hallway with the teacher. And the teacher would say, your child chewed gum, or he didn't bring a handkerchief, or something like that. And the mother didn't know what the teacher was saying, but she would take her hand and whack the kid across the head. That's what every mother did, whacked her kid across the head. Now, when I read that story to the children, they had two questions. One was, so what's so important about a handkerchief? And I had to explain this was before Kleenex, and you know, oh, they said, okay. And I said, think of your mother's washing and ironing all those handkerchiefs. But the other question, a very sensible one, was why didn't the school provide a translator? And there I had to tell them that wouldn't have done it. The kids could have translated. They didn't. They were embarrassed. They didn't want the teacher to know their mom couldn't speak English. And in these stories, there are multiple. I mean, these are Bronx stories. Irma Fleck is a little girl. She spoke German when she went to school, and they treated her as stupid. Another child spoke only Yiddish, and likewise. And Mike Nunez spoke only Spanish when he first went to school and was humiliated. And he said, there was no bilingual education, there was no ESL, nobody thought it was great that you had two languages, they thought you were dumb. And this resonates across a number of the stories. That early childhood experience when you were speaking another language, coming from another country, another culture, you moved up from the Lower East Side, you were speaking Yiddish, you weren't speaking English until you got thrown into those Irish teachers. So there are a number of themes in the book. I wasn't looking for them. I discovered them after the book was made, but they're threads that go back and forth. I think, unless you want me to read more, I would be happy to answer questions. I mean, the stories are wonderful, and the more I live with them, the more I come to love these people. And now, to say, some of the descendants of some of the people in here we're on Facebook together, so it's become a real family. Anderson's has the books, I have the books, Amazon has the books. We have 3 different prices. Bookstores have to sell it for $30 plus tax. That's what they have to do. I sell them for $25. Amazon, I think, sells them for $23, possibly $20. I think it's $20. Anyway, but they're good stories. And to me, what I love most is the stories. And yet, thanks to Janet, this book is useful to historians, it is useful to academics, because it was published by an academic press in Texas, of all places. And a couple of the reviewers, the early reviewers said, yeah, it should be published, the stories are good, but you know, where are the academic underpinnings? Where are the footnotes? These are just stories. And as you all know, oral history is the way you remember things, is not necessarily the way they happened. You need someone to verify the place and the date and the discrepancies. In fact, there's a quote here which I love at the very beginning of the book. Let's see if I can find it. Yes. History is not a record of what really happened, but of what men believe really happened. For without witnesses, history becomes a victory of the imagination over actuality. So anyway, they said, where were the academic underpinnings? And I knew I couldn't do it. I'm not a historian. It's many years since I've been doing any real research, and this amazing woman is from the Bronx, was in the library, and I don't know how many of you know librarians. They're the best researchers in the world. Forget academics, the other academics. Librarians know where to find information. Janet put, I would say, doubled the value of this book by putting amazing footnotes and narrative footnotes. I've had friends who say they read the book with 2 bookmarks because they'll read about something and then they'll look at what Janet said about it because they're so illuminating, and the bibliography. And we also had several All I wrote was the introduction, which is long, and I love it, but that's my part of the book, and selecting the stories. But Fernando Freddie Ferrer, borough president, when I asked him if he would write an introduction to the book, he said, yes, I'd be delighted. And when he did it, he said he knew almost every person in the book. Almost every person. He knew them in some way, because he was out in the community. He was involved. And another historian who's at SUNY Albany. So it's a book of many contributors. What did I count the other day? 22 people. The 16 stories. You and me. The 2 photographers. I guess it's up to 20. And Fernando Ferrer and the historian Ray Bromley. So people say to me, your book, and I say, yes, but a team of 22 people created this book, and that's part of what's wonderful about it. So, any questions? Yes, sir.
I went to college in the Bronx, and I've had a long-running debate with a friend of mine who wrote a book comparing the Bronx and Brooklyn. What's your take on that comparison?
Well, we have the Bronx, obviously.
Well, Brooklyn's twice the size of the Bronx, so.
The Bronx is often maligned. One of the things that the historian Ray Bromley said, which I love, because many people have said, why is everybody always saying how awful the Bronx was? The Bronx was this, the Bronx was, the really urban, they talked about the Bronx, we talked about urban decay and everything else, drugs, you name it. And he said, yeah, that's true. The media does that. The Bronx is the poster child for all those things. Why? It's no worse than Memphis or Detroit or Flint or a dozen other cities you and I could name. He said it's because the Bronx is part of New York City. And New York City gets more media attention than any place in the world, more than London, more than Paris, and so the Bronx is right there. It's easy for the primary media in this country to say, whoops, here's where, things are really bad. Why didn't we do that to Brooklyn? I don't know. Brooklyn's had its moments, but the Bronx was the poster child. People talk about Charlotte Street as though there were no other burned buildings in the country. That's idiocy, and unfair, and yet there's no way around it. I clip, even though the book is done now, I clip every time there's a positive article about the Bronx in the New York Times. And a lot of them start with in spite of, they're still trying to, but Brooklyn is, as you say, much bigger. It's where all the young folk are going now, although it's getting out of price. I must have 8 different nieces and nephews out there. They're going to be moving somewhere soon. Which college did you go to? Ford? Sorry? Which college in Brooklyn?
Yeah, Ford.
Yes.
Summarize how you think the Bronx has changed in those days, since the 70s and the 80s, because it seems to be making a circle now.
Yes,
Back.
yes, all those burnt out buildings are gone, and
I can't hear you.
the Bronx in the 70s, we went through the Austin wave in the 70s, and if you used to ride the train, even in '85 when I came to Leland, you'd ride the number 4 train downtown, and you'd see these buildings that were just standing there. They were hulking buildings, and that had fires, or there'd be, or the windows would be boarded up, and that sort of thing. And all of those buildings have either been leveled or they've been restored. So people come in from Europe looking for this devastated Bronx, and it's all built up. And we've had people doing films. They've come to the Bronx, and it's hard to find these burnt out buildings. The other thing about the Bronx too is particularly the West Bronx. The buildings are very tall buildings, 5- and 6-story buildings. And there's a difference between when a building like that burns and there's no lights and it's this hulking presence, and as opposed to like lower level buildings, 2- and 3-story buildings. And I remember driving to Washington D.C. In the 70s, and somehow we wound up in parts of Philadelphia and Baltimore, and I was looking at these burnt out buildings, and they weren't 5- and 6-story buildings, but they were lower level buildings. But I'm thinking to myself, I thought this was just the Bronx, but it was going on in other cities. It was also going on in Brooklyn too, so Brooklyn wasn't in great shape either. And I remember we got lost in Brooklyn one time. We were coming home from a party, and we were driving through a street. There were no street lights in some section of Brooklyn. I didn't even know what section it was. But I thought to have no street lights at all in a city is incredible.
I think the parks are getting a lot of attention. The Bronx has more parkland than any of the boroughs. It really has got amazing parks, and the attention that you get to botanical gardens, for example, that huge article just this week on the Frida Kahlo exhibit and on the other exhibits they had, and the Bronx Zoo, of course. And there's been a lot of rebuilding. There's been a lot of positive action taken. When I see my nieces and nephews moving from Brooklyn to the Bronx or coming straight from the Midwest to the Bronx, then I'll know it's really done the turnaround. But even 30 years ago, some of the people in the book were saying, it's turning around, it's going to turn around. You have superb transportation lines. The subways are great. Yes, go ahead.
I think if you grew up in New York City, you can't think of the Bronx without thinking of the Bronx High School of Science. And the most prestigious of all the special schools in the city, Stuyvesant, Brooklyn Tech, and they have...
The Bronx High School of Science was always known to anybody in New York City.
And still, the most brilliant students get into that school. And someone who graduated from that school wrote a memoir about what he remembered about that school. And one story I remember was, the teacher said, is there any city in the world besides The Hague that's named The Hague? And they're all sitting there, and one kid said, the Bronx, because no one says Bronx.
I think a lot of efforts, a lot of community efforts. I think of a colleague of mine at the college who, well, she does this wherever in the world she is, but while we were still there in the 80s, she cared deeply about greening, and we were early recycling and everything at Lehman. She and I started a lot of that. She worked with, sort of like Art Fleck, she worked with the Botanical Garden, she worked with our borough president, she worked with the MTA, the whole area around the Bedford Park subway station, it's right next to Lehman College on the Lexington line. She got the graffiti removed, she got plants put around that the garden donated. She even, I remember a guy who had a truck, with his delis and all. He painted the graffiti off his truck to keep it clean and beautiful, and this whole area, and the trash was picked up, and kids started being more respectful of it. So that's the kind of thing, how much each individual can do, and this has been going on. Someone else had a hand.
When you were talking about the different groups of people who you interviewed, it sounds to me like these neighborhoods were the original melting pots, so-called melting pots of our country, and I grew up in Brooklyn, and it was the same way.
Of course.
So, and you spoke about the kids not being able, their parents not being able to speak English, or in some cases the children. And my mother grew up in Brooklyn in one of those neighborhoods where everyone was either from Italy or Ireland or Poland, it seems to me. And she said that her best friend came into school in the 2nd grade, couldn't speak a word of English. 2 weeks later, she could speak English. That's called immersion therapy. And I suppose a lot of the children, without having the English as a second language, really learned to speak English.
Mario Biaggi's story is different from all those others who came to school not speaking English. He said he always regretted that his parents did not speak Italian to him at home.
Right.
So he didn't really know Italian. And one of his daughters, whom I've met, who's a very nice young woman, Jackie, had gone to Italy deliberately and became fluent in Italian. He was so proud of that. And he tried wherever he could to promote legislation to have bilingualism in the schools and to help. So that was a different twist on it. Yeah. Yes.
Yes, I grew up in the Bronx, and my mom lived there till 1995. And when people would hear I was from the Bronx, so she lived there, it was this stigma, this was disaster. And it was a beautiful area then, it's a beautiful area now, and we bought a home in Larchmont because I couldn't afford this same home in Pelham Gardens in the Bronx at the time. But when you say a melting pot, there was a lot of prejudice in the area I lived in. I was one of very few Jewish families there. And at one point, all of our friends turned against us. It was either the Cohen girls or us, and the boys, and they all dumped us. They absolutely dumped us. And my parents almost moved from there, which I'm glad they didn't. And I'm still friendly with a couple of them. So,
Where did you say you lived in the Bronx?
I lived in Pelham Gardens.
Yeah. Okay.
It's like the East Bronx,
Right, yeah.
not too far from Einstein.
Right, yeah, no, I know.
And it's still a lovely area.
Yeah, there's a lot of areas in the Bronx.
Yeah.
Even during the 70s, we were going through the Austin wave. that were very stable neighborhoods. I mean, Parkchester, I was living in Parkchester at the
But
time.
still a lot of prejudice.
Yeah.
I remember we were selling my mom's home, and we had some, I think it was, we had maybe he was Indian, the realtor, and there was a family of some sort of Asian descent, and the neighbors stood out there with their arms folded across their chests, like, how dare you? And, you know, so then that would be what, my mother's gone 20 years now. So, but it still existed, it was still there, like they thought they were really protecting it. And it's become very Asian now, I think. And,
I was brought up in Bronx, and our connection to this day is still quite lovely.
It is.
Oh, yeah.
Very
Club
lovely.
area,
Yeah.
beautiful, my brother still lives there.
Yeah, very pretty.
Yeah, no, it's true.
It's a great place to grow up.
And Rocco failed Italian because they spoke the dialect in the house.
Great, yes.
One of the things that happens when you attend a couple of these things, my wife Janet, is that you pick up some of the other things that happen when you're looking at point of view. And I think you had said it one time, Emita, that the person taking the picture of the building here, if they just turned around, would have seen the other point of view.
Yeah.
You know, and you can't necessarily
Right.
blame the media because that's what sells papers.
Exactly.
And gets the network to pick up on something.
And they're pretty terrific schools. I went to Cardinal Hayes.
Yes, very good.
Yeah.
And that was wonderful.
Cardinal
Rita
Hayes.
Philbin was there.
Cardinal Hayes.
Scorsese and George Carlin was
Right.
thrown out of there.
Right. Celebrities. Sir, you had your hand up.
Speak to the impact of Robert Moses on one side of the ledger. Wait, think about it.
I haven't been able to sleep since I read Caro's book on it.
If you read Caro's book, you know what
I
he
did.
wanted to do with that cover. He wanted to cover that highway, and they took the money away from him. He couldn't. His design was to cover that like a parkway from one
What was
side
that?
to the other.
Moses?
The other guy that I think of all the time, especially with Charlotte Street, is Ed Logue.
Oh, yeah, he's in the book.
And the impact he had was Howard Cosell told the viewers watching the
Yeah.
series game, the Bronx is burning, the Bronx is burning.
Yeah.
Ed Logue was already at work rebuilding Charlotte Street.
Yeah.
Not a one-hand job, but he was a visionary.
Yeah. And it was brilliant that they were one-family houses and not yet another tower.
Absolutely.
People
Picket fences.
heard it and like,
Oh, yes. My friend at the time was a borough engineer in the Bronx. We grew up in the shade of what was Hunter College when we were kids.
right.
We swam in the reservoir, and he was borough engineer. He became responsible for that reservoir.
I love that
But he worked
reservoir.
low on the Charlotte.
A lot of interesting ducks would come through on that reservoir. I'd ask my son, who's an ornithologist. Yes, sir.
Apropos of the languages, I heard this story, I think it's true. Colin Powell grew up in the Bronx.
Yes.
And it was, this goes back before the book time, of course. At any rate, large Jewish population there at the time, and he was sent out many times to the stores. And I'm not sure if he ever worked in a Jewish store, but at any rate, he picked up Yiddish to the extent that he could understand it and he could speak it. And the story is that when he was Secretary of State and got off the plane on a state trip to Israel, he let the Prime Minister who was meeting him have a whole load of Yiddish before he talked any English.
That's true.
That's a great story.
And then the one other person who worked in the Bronx but was a famous non-resident whom I visited a number of times was Babe Ruth.
Oh, wow.
So you want to mention him.
Yeah.
Now, my grandfather was an iceman. He delivered ice to Jewish people. And so he learned Yiddish.
Right.
Oh,
So
wow.
he'd always come home and he'd start speaking to me in 10 and Yiddish. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's funny, in New York, you really, I mean, we all know some Yiddish just by living where we live.
The smart.
Yeah, I mean, even the Times, you know, they use these phrases, and, you know, people that don't know it are going to miss what's being said.
Yeah.
It's a great place.
Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question. My husband, I was married at the time, went to Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and then left for many years and came back, so now there again. And the college, the medical school, is very involved in a lot of the programs in the Bronx now, and I don't know if that has an impact or if there's anything in the library about the development of the school and its impact
I know that
on the
they
Bronx,
had approached
or in the
Fordham
Bronx.
University to set up a medical school, and because they had Fordham Hospital at the time, but they felt that it was just going to be too expensive and they couldn't do it. Yeah.
There's a big nursing program at Lehman. They work with all the hospitals in the
Yeah.
Bronx. Very big nursing program.
Yes.
I had heard from somebody that Co-op City changed the Bronx.
Yes.
Yes.
We used to go to Freedom Land
One of the people here said the timing of that.
before
just
Co-op
was
City
so
was
bad
built.
That it was like a vacuum,
Exodus.
sucking people out and leaving a vacuum behind them. It was, I mean, so many things came together, and bad city planning in putting large numbers of very poor people in one place. And as one of the, probably Mo Greenstein, the realtor, said, he's not blaming them, but they had not had belongings. They'd not had apartments to take care of, and to have, as opposed to mixed income housing, to just go whoosh, we're going to dump in the Bronx all our poor. And it was a disaster. It was a recipe for disaster. But yeah, Co-op City was a part of that great flight. At the same, you know, the timing was.
In Co-op City, you're saying they would put all these...
No, Co-op City.
Oh, in the Bronx.
And that left a vacuum.
Oh, I see.
It was just a lot of things, you know, came together that were. It's like a storm. It's like Sandy, you know, the full moon and the high tide, and then, you know. Yes.
Yeah, I've got two comments. One, Jimmy Carter had something to do with revitalizing some parts at some point. I don't recall the specifics of that. Charlotte Street was that. And the other, you haven't mentioned one of the magic words to me of the Bronx, because I worked there for 9 years on the Grand Concourse.
Oh, yeah. It's so beautiful.
Oh, indeed.
It's still beautiful.
I worked at the oldest nursing home in the Bronx, and right across from the Poe Cottage. And that was a whole thing in itself. A very strange man was the one who took you on tours, and you better not go alone. That's all I could say. During the time I went alone. But it was a wonderful experience, and of course with the Botanical Gardens not so far, and of course the Bronx Zoo near there. But a couple of the people that we had as patients in that home, that was started out for proper ladies of Protestant background who had not, they couldn't have touched alcohol, but it was one or the other. They'd either been drug addicts, and that was forbidden, and they wouldn't accept them way back in 1880, when this home opened, the House of the Holy Comforter. And they had to be proper ladies. There were wards, 14-bed wards, which if anyone's been to a nursing home, you don't have those anymore. And I just recall two people I wish so much there had been a way of connecting them. One, a Chinese family, which it's very, very hard for Chinese people to put people in a home. You didn't do that. You took care of them. And we had a terribly hard time because this woman desperately needed more help than she could get at home. And that was a bit of a struggle and certainly a learning experience. Another was a survivor of the Titanic. And it was just a wonderful thing to think. This little Irish maid who'd come over, of course, with so many, and had her very tough experiences, but lived in the Bronx and then ended up with us. This is between 76 and 85 that I was involved there. But I just wish so much, you know, sharing stories with some of those people having what you will have done. This is wonderful. I have to be ready.
What do you have against Arthur Avenue? You haven't mentioned
I love Arthur Avenue. I got to tell you, every time I went down to work with Janet in the last 2 years to getting the book put together, I would stop by Arthur Avenue on the way home and buy some things to bring them home. I love Arthur Avenue. It's a treasure. You're right, it needs to be talked about more. And our colleague who did not Walter Rosenblum, but Georgine Comerford, who did the children's pictures, she still lives on the concourse. She's lived on the concourse forever. Her mother died last year, but Georgine's is there. It's a beautiful, beautiful buildings there, and they're beginning to sell for real money. I mean, the concourse is coming back, and other parts of the Bronx are coming back.
Which had
Yeah,
vacations
beautiful.
So, thank you so much for listening to us.
And we Emita is a driver for At Home on the Sound. She's one of our volunteers, so we doubly thank her.